James Carter was not supposed to be here. Not in a mansion, not as a bank CEO, and definitely not as the man in charge of millions. But here he was. And yet, even at the top, the world still found ways to remind him where he came from. At 42, James was the CEO of one of the largest banks in the country, a self-made man who had clawed his way out of Southside Chicago. But today, the weight of his success felt heavier than ever. James Carter leaned back, his eyes scanning the mountain of paperwork in front of him. Not just reports, numbers, or business projections, but proof of the walls he had spent his whole life tearing down. Every contract signed, every policy reviewed, every boardroom battle fought. They weren't victories, they were scars, scars of a fight that had never really ended. His fingers tapped against the desk as his mind drifted back, to long nights in a cramped apartment, to a father who came home with grease-stained hands and tired eyes. "You've got to be 10 times better than them," his father's voice echoed, as sharp now as it had been when James was just a boy. Not twice, not 5 times, 10. Because no matter how high you climbed, they would always find a way to remind you where you came from. He thought about his father, a steel mill worker who had been fired for speaking up about unsafe conditions. "You've got to be 10 times better than them," his father had always said. Those words had driven James to succeed, but they also haunted him. No matter how much he achieved, the world had a way of dragging him back, forcing him to prove again and again that he belonged. James exhaled, a slow, measured breath, his fingers curled around the armrests of his chair before he pushed himself up. This wasn't just a routine visit. It wasn't a publicity stunt or a simple check-in. This was reconnaissance. He grabbed his old leather jacket, the one that didn't scream CEO but just another man walking through the city. No bodyguards, no suits, no pretense. Because today, James wasn't going in as a bank executive. Today, he was going in as the man the world still saw him as, the black man they didn't believe belonged. And if the whispers about discrimination at this branch were true, then today, someone was going to answer for it. James wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Hell, there wasn't even a plastic one. His father worked double shifts at a steel mill until the day he was fired for daring to speak up about unsafe working conditions. "You've got to be 10 times better than them," his father used to say. The words seared into James's brain like a brand. Not twice, 10 times, because they'll never let you forget who you are. James had taken that advice to heart. He'd clawed his way out of Southside Chicago, through scholarships, internships, and endless late nights. He built himself into a man that people couldn't ignore. And yet, here he was, 20 years later, staring at a stack of papers like it was some cruel reminder that no matter how far you go, the world has a way of dragging you back down. But James wasn't about to let that happen. Not today. Today, he had a plan. You see, James had this little habit. Every now and then, he liked to go undercover. No suits, no ties, no chauffeur waiting in the car. Just James in a beat-up leather jacket and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. It was his way of staying grounded, of seeing the world the way most people did, unvarnished and raw. And today, he decided to visit one of the branches of his own bank. Not for a big meeting, not to shake hands and make speeches, but just to see how things really ran when nobody knew who he was. He'd picked a branch downtown, the kind of place that looked polished on the outside, but had a reputation for treating its customers less than fairly. James had heard whispers, complaints about long wait times, dismissive staff, and, in more than one case, outright discrimination. It wasn't something he could ignore. He grabbed his wallet, his keys, and a baseball cap that had seen better days, and headed out the door. He wasn't expecting much. A few raised eyebrows, maybe a little impatience from the staff. But what he walked into? That was a whole different story. The downtown branch of Carter Bank was sleek and modern, with marble floors and shiny counters. But as James walked in, the atmosphere felt cold and unwelcoming. The staff, mostly white, barely glanced at him. A few customers were scattered around, waiting in line or filling out forms. James made his way to the counter, keeping his head low. The teller, a man in his mid-30s with a name tag that read Mike, gave James a once-over that lasted just a little too long. Can I help you? Mike asked, his tone dripping with fake politeness. Yes, James replied evenly. I'd like to withdraw $5,000 from my account. Mike raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly. Do you have ID? James handed over his driver's license and bank card. Mike took them with deliberate slowness, typing the account number into the computer. After a moment, he frowned. Yeah, we can't do that. James blinked. Excuse me? We don't have that kind of cash on hand, Mike said, shrugging. You'd need to put in a request, and even then, we'd have to verify certain things. Certain things? James repeated, his voice dangerously calm. Like what? Mike smirked. Like whether the funds are legitimate. The words hung in the air like a bad smell. James felt the weight of every barrier he'd ever had to break through, every indignity he'd swallowed just to get to where he was. And here he was again, being treated like a criminal for daring to exist. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to let this guy see how much he'd gotten under his skin. Not yet. Well, James said, leaning slightly closer to the counter. How about you check again? Mike sighed dramatically, like James was asking him to perform brain surgery. Look, sir, he said, dragging out the last word like it was an insult. Even if we had the cash, which we don't, you'd need to provide additional documentation. To prove you're not, James's jaw tightened. No, I don't know. Why don't you explain it to me? Mike hesitated, then leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Let's just say we have policies. Gotta make sure everything checks out. You understand? James understood perfectly, and in that moment, he made a decision. This wasn't going to end here. James let out a slow, humorless chuckle, the kind that wasn't amused, just calculating. Let me get this straight, he said, his voice smooth but sharp enough to cut. You're looking me in the eye and telling me I need to prove my own money is mine? The silence in the bank was deafening. Mike swallowed, his smirk faltering just slightly, but he still held his ground. It's just policy, sir. Policy? James repeated, his tone lethal. Tell me, Mike, do those policies magically apply to people who look like me? Or do you ask everyone to jump through hoops for their own damn money? A middle-aged woman in line gasped softly. Another customer, a younger guy in a hoodie, muttered under his breath, Yo, this is messed up. James didn't break eye contact, didn't move, didn't flinch. He wasn't just standing at a bank counter anymore. He was standing at the crossroads of every battle he'd ever fought, and he wasn't backing down. Mike shrugged, the smirk returning. Hey, I didn't say that, but people like… James cut him off, his voice rising slightly. People like me? Go on, finish the sentence. Mike hesitated, clearly realizing he'd stepped into dangerous territory. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. All I'm saying is, we've got rules, and people like you don't always fit the profile. The room went silent. A middle-aged woman in line gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest like she'd just witnessed a car crash. Another customer, a younger guy, muttered, Damn, dude, under his breath. James could feel the weight of their stares, but he wasn't here for their sympathy. He was here for a point, and for his money. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to smile. All right, Mike, he said, his voice calm but lethal. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to process my withdrawal right now, or I'll make a call, and we'll see how your policies hold up when corporate gets involved. Mike's face twitched. For a split second, the smug confidence wavered. But then, as if deciding to die on this hill, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. Call whoever you want, he sneered. But I don't care if you have the Pope's phone number. Without the right documentation, you're not getting a cent. James blinked, stunned by the sheer audacity. Then he laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that made Mike sit back in his chair. Okay, James said, straightening up. You've made your point. Let's see how far this goes. James pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The room fell silent as he spoke into the receiver. Get me the regional manager, now. Mike's smirk faltered as he watched James. The realization was creeping in. This wasn't just some random guy looking for a fight. When David Reynolds, the regional manager, arrived, He took one look at James and paled. "Mr. Carter, I didn't realize you were visiting today." The room erupted in gasps. Mike looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. James turned to David, his expression cool and composed. "I didn't realize either, David. But it seems your staff needs a little retraining." James stood tall, his presence commanding the room. He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto Mike's. The tension in the air was palpable, and every eye in the bank was fixed on him. "Let me make one thing clear," James said, his voice steady but laced with authority. "I am James Carter, the CEO of this bank, and what I've witnessed here today is unacceptable." The room erupted in gasps. Mike's face turned pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by sheer panic. David, the regional manager, who had just arrived, looked like he wanted to disappear. James continued, his tone sharp and unyielding. "This branch has a reputation for treating customers unfairly, and today I've seen it firsthand." Mike here refused to process a simple withdrawal, demanding unnecessary documentation and implying that my funds were illegitimate. "Is this how we treat our customers?" David stammered. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, this is not our standard." James cut him off. "Save it, David. I don't want excuses. I want action. Effective immediately, Mike is fired. And this branch will undergo a full audit to uncover any other instances of discrimination or misconduct." David nodded furiously, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Of course, Mr. Carter, I'll handle it personally." James turned to the customers, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mix of shock and admiration. "To everyone here today, I apologize for the way you've been treated. This is not the standard we set at Carter Bank, and I promise you, it will not happen again." A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. You don't know how much this means to us." James gave her a small smile. "I do, because I've been where you are, and I won't let this system fail anyone else." The room erupted in applause. Customers who had been silent earlier now voiced their support, sharing their own experiences of mistreatment. James listened intently, his resolve growing stronger with every story. As the customers began to leave, James took a moment to reflect. He thought about his father, about the struggles he'd faced growing up in Southside Chicago. He thought about the countless others who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. This wasn't just about one bad employee or one poorly managed branch. This was about systemic change, and James was determined to make it happen. He turned to David, who was still standing awkwardly nearby. "David, I want a full report on this branch's operations by the end of the week, and I want every employee here to undergo mandatory bias training. Understood?" David nodded quickly. "Yes, Mr. Carter. It won't happen again." James gave him a curt nod. "See that it doesn't." James wasted no time in initiating the audit. He called in a team of external auditors, ensuring that the process would be thorough and unbiased. The audit covered every aspect of the branch's operations: customer service, employee conduct, financial transactions, and complaint resolution processes. The findings were shocking. The audit revealed a pattern of discriminatory practices, including racial bias, dismissive staff behavior, and a lack of accountability. Black customers were routinely subjected to longer wait times and more stringent documentation requirements compared to their white counterparts. Employees often ignored or dismissed complaints from minority customers, treating them with suspicion and disrespect. There was no formal system for tracking or addressing customer complaints, allowing misconduct to go unchecked. James reviewed the audit report with a heavy heart. He had built Carter Bank from the ground up, and seeing such blatant discrimination within his own organization was a bitter pill to swallow. But he knew that acknowledging the problem was the first step toward fixing it. He called an emergency meeting with the bank's executive team. The atmosphere in the boardroom was tense as he presented the audit findings. "This is unacceptable," James said, his voice firm but calm. "We cannot claim to serve our customers while allowing such practices to continue. Effective immediately, we will implement the following changes. First, all employees, from tellers to executives, would undergo comprehensive training on racial bias and cultural sensitivity. Second, a new system would be introduced to track and address customer complaints, ensuring accountability at every level. Third, the bank would actively recruit and promote employees from underrepresented communities, creating a more inclusive workplace. Finally, a platform would be launched to allow customers to provide real-time feedback on their experiences, with a dedicated team to address concerns promptly. The executives nodded in agreement, but James could see the unease in their eyes. Change was never easy, but he was determined to see it through. After the meeting, James returned to his office and sat down at his desk. He stared out the window, the city skyline stretching out before him. His mind wandered back to his childhood in Southside Chicago, to the struggles he had faced and the lessons he had learned. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You've got to be 10 times better than them." James had lived by those words, working tirelessly to overcome every obstacle in his path. But now, as the CEO of a major bank, he realized that his fight wasn't just about personal success. It was about creating a system that treated everyone fairly, regardless of their background. He thought about the customers who had been wronged, the employees who had turned a blind eye, and the countless others who had been failed by the system. He knew that the changes he was implementing were just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it head-on. James picked up a pen and began drafting a letter to the bank's customers. He wanted to assure them that their voices had been heard and that their concerns would be addressed. As he wrote, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fixing a broken branch. It was about building a better future for everyone. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The bias training sessions began, and the new complaint resolution system was rolled out. James made it a point to visit the branch regularly, speaking directly with customers and employees to ensure that the changes were being implemented effectively. One day, as he was leaving the branch, a young black man approached him. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice filled with gratitude, "I just want to thank you. What you're doing here, it means a lot to people like me." James smiled and shook the man's hand. "Thank you for saying that, but this is just the beginning. We have a long way to go." As he walked to his car, James felt a sense of pride and determination. He knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but he was ready to lead the charge. James walked out of the bank, the crisp autumn air hitting his face. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city skyline. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief and determination. The confrontation inside had been intense, but it was necessary. He knew that real change wouldn't come easy, but he was ready to face the challenges ahead. As he walked down the street, he thought about the customers he had addressed earlier. Their faces, filled with hope and gratitude, reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his mother. "Proud of you, son. Keep fighting the good fight." James smiled, feeling a surge of emotion. His mother had always been his biggest supporter, and her words gave him the strength to keep going. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The audit he had ordered would uncover more issues, and implementing systemic changes would require relentless effort. But James was no stranger to hard work. He had clawed his way out of Southside Chicago, and he wasn't about to back down now. As he reached his car, he paused for a moment, looking back at the bank. The building stood tall and imposing, a symbol of the system he was determined to reform. He knew that this was just the beginning. There were other branches, other employees, and other customers who needed his help, and he was ready to fight for them. James got into his car and started the engine. As he drove away, he glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the bank's logo. It was a simple design, a circle with the initials CB in bold letters. But to James, it represented so much more. It was a symbol of the system he had built, the system he was now determined to fix. He thought about his father's words, "You've got to be 10 times better than them." Those words had driven him to succeed, but they had also reminded him of the barriers he had faced. Now, as he looked at the logo, he realized that he had the power to break down those barriers, not just for himself, but for everyone who came after him. James stepped outside, the crisp autumn air biting against his skin. The confrontation was over, but the war wasn't. Just as he reached for his car door, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He frowned, swiping to read the message. Nice stunt, Carter. But some doors aren't meant to be opened. Walk away. James exhaled slowly. He had seen intimidation before. He had walked into boardrooms where men twice his age tried to silence him, into offices where they smiled in his face but resented his presence. But James Carter had never been the kind of man to stay in his lane. He deleted the message. Then, with a slow, knowing smirk, he climbed into his car. If they thought this would silence him, they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. As he drove into the sunset, James smiled. He knew that real change started with him, and he was ready to lead the way.